She planned his dream anniversary celebration. Then she found the secret financial decisions he hid for years. Tracy Williams always kept a few extra copies of everything: receipts, old photographs, handwritten notes, little reminders of moments she never wanted her family to forget. That was the kind of person she was. So on the morning of her 10th wedding anniversary, while sunlight came through the windows of their home just outside Nashville, Tennessee, she was sitting on the floor of their home office, surrounded by pictures, decorations, and memories she had spent 6 months collecting. She was looking for one final piece to complete the surprise she had planned for Eric, a small detail she thought would make him smile. But instead, she found a folder she had never seen before. At first, she didn't think much of it. Eric was organized, careful, the kind of man who labeled everything and kept track of every responsibility in their lives. If there was one thing Tracy trusted completely, it was that her husband was responsible with money. Then she opened the folder, and slowly, the smile on her face disappeared. There were account statements she didn't recognize, transfers she had never discussed, payments made over years that she knew nothing about. She looked at the dates again, hoping she had misunderstood something, because this wasn't just about money. It was about the fact that while she had been spending months preparing a celebration about how well she knew her husband, she was suddenly realizing there was a part of his life he had kept completely separate from her. She sat there quietly, holding those papers in her hands, looking around the room she had filled with memories of their marriage. And one question kept coming back to her. How could the person who knew her better than anyone spend years carrying something this important without ever letting her stand beside him? Welcome to Daily Comfort Stories, my wonderful family. I'm truly grateful to have you here. If you're new, comment your time and where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe as we continue sharing meaningful stories together. Long before Tracy Williams discovered the folder that changed the way she looked at her marriage, she had already spent most of her life learning how to notice the things people tried to hide. Growing up in Nashville, Tennessee, Tracy became the kind of person who could tell something was wrong before anyone said a word. She noticed when her mother, Denise, smiled a little less after a difficult day at work. She noticed when her father, Calvin, came home from repairing industrial equipment and placed his keys on the kitchen counter more quietly than usual. To most people, those things might have seemed small. To Tracy, they were signs. She learned early that people often carried their struggles silently. Her parents loved each other. That was never something Tracy questioned. Their home was filled with kindness, family dinners, and the simple routines that made a house feel like home. But love did not mean life was always easy. There were seasons when money was tight. There were months when unexpected expenses created stress. There were conversations that stopped when children walked into the room. Tracy remembered seeing her parents sit at the kitchen table late at night, talking in low voices about bills and responsibilities. She did not understand everything they were discussing back then, but she understood the feeling that something heavy existed, even when everyone was pretending everything was fine. Her father, Calvin, was the type of man who believed providing for his family was one of the most important things he could do. He worked hard, fixed things around the house, and rarely complained. Her mother, Denise, was the person everyone depended on. She cared for relatives, supported neighbors, and somehow always found energy to help someone else. Watching them shaped Tracy. She admired their dedication, but she also absorbed something she did not realize at the time. She learned that love often meant carrying a burden quietly. If someone was tired, you helped them. If someone was struggling, you stepped in. If someone you loved was hurting, you tried to make things easier before they even asked. That belief followed Tracy into adulthood. Friends described her as dependable, the person who remembered birthdays, checked in after difficult conversations, and stayed late at work when a coworker needed support. She was the person people trusted with their problems. But there was something Tracy rarely admitted. Sometimes being the person everyone relied on became exhausting. She wanted to be loved, but she also wanted to be useful. And somewhere along the way, those two things became connected in her mind. When Tracy imagined marriage, she did not dream about expensive vacations or a perfect house. She wanted something much simpler. She wanted a relationship where two people could be honest with each other, a place where someone could say, "I'm scared," without feeling like they had failed. A marriage where problems were not hidden behind closed doors. Ironically, The woman who wanted that kind of honesty had already developed a habit that would challenge her future relationship. She was so used to noticing everyone else's pain that she often forgot to let people notice hers. Tracy believed love meant showing up. She believed love meant sacrifice. She believed love meant protecting the people around her. She just had not yet learned that real love also meant allowing someone else to carry part of the weight. And years later, that lesson would become one of the most important ones of her life. Eric Carter grew up believing that a responsible person was someone who handled problems before anyone else had to notice them. That belief did not come from a bad place. It came from watching his father. Richard Carter was a hard-working man who spent most of his life doing physical labor. Construction work was not easy, and there were many days when he came home tired, with his hands worn from long hours on job sites. But Eric never remembered his father complaining. Richard believed that being a man meant taking care of your family. If something needed fixing, he fixed it. If something needed to be paid, he found a way. If something was worrying him, he kept it to himself. As a child, Eric admired that about him. He saw his father as someone who could handle anything. But there was one memory from his teenage years that stayed with Eric long after he became an adult. He was 16 years old when he walked into the kitchen one evening and saw Richard sitting alone at the table. The house was quiet. Usually, his father would have been watching television or asking about Eric's day. But that night, Richard was staring down at a stack of papers spread across the table. Bills, statements, numbers Eric did not fully understand at the time. The moment Richard noticed his son standing there, he quickly moved some papers together and placed them face down. "Everything okay?" Eric asked. Richard looked up and smiled. "Yeah, everything's fine." Eric knew that answer was not true. He was old enough to understand when someone was pretending. But his father had already made the decision. Eric was not going to carry that worry. So Richard smiled, told him not to stay up too late, and went back to sorting through the papers after Eric left the room. Years later, Eric would remember that moment differently. As a teenager, he thought his father was protecting him. As an adult, he realized his father had been protecting himself too. Richard was not trying to hurt anyone. He was trying to be strong for the people he loved. That lesson stayed with Eric. When he became a husband one day, he promised himself that his family would never feel unsafe because of him. He would plan ahead. He would work harder. He would solve problems before they became problems. And for many years, that mindset served him well. Eric became known as someone people could depend on. At work, he was the person managers trusted with difficult situations. As a commercial property manager, he handled complicated issues calmly. Tenants respected him because he listened carefully and followed through. Friends described him as steady, reliable, the person you wanted around when life became complicated. But there was another side to Eric that most people did not see. His calmness was sometimes a way of avoiding vulnerability. When something went wrong, his first instinct was not to ask for help. It was to figure out how to fix it alone. He told himself that this was love, that keeping stress away from others was an act of kindness. But Eric did not understand something important. There is a difference between protecting someone from unnecessary pain and keeping them away from the truth. The first can be an act of love. The second can create distance. That difference would become one of the hardest lessons Eric ever had to learn. Because when Eric eventually built a life with Tracy, he found someone who did not want him to be perfect. She did not need him to solve every problem before she knew it existed. She wanted to stand beside him. But Eric had spent years believing that the strongest person in the room was the one who carried the most weight without asking anyone to help. And sometimes the habits people create to survive difficult moments are the same habits that later make it difficult for them to fully connect with the people they love. Before Tracy Williams and Eric Carter became the couple sitting across from each other trying to understand years of hidden decisions, they were simply two people who happened to meet while trying to make their community a little better. Their first conversation was not romantic. There was no instant connection, no moment where either of them walked away thinking they had just met the person they would spend their life with. Actually, their first impression of each other was a little frustrating. It happened during a neighborhood restoration project in Nashville. The volunteer group was working to repair several older homes in a community that needed support. They had limited funding, limited supplies, and many people depending on them to make the right choices. Eric was reviewing the budget documents when Tracy walked over and looked at the numbers on his clipboard. "You're really planning to cut the community meal from the project?" she asked. Eric looked up, slightly surprised. "I'm planning to make sure we can actually finish the project," he replied. Tracy crossed her arms. "I understand budgeting, Eric, but those meals are where people actually come together. Some families are showing up because they want help, but some are showing up because they finally feel like someone sees them." Eric glanced back at the spreadsheet. "And if we spend money on everything we want, we may not have enough to complete the repairs that people actually need." For a moment, neither of them said anything. They were both convinced they were right. Tracy thought Eric cared too much about numbers. Eric thought Tracy cared so much about emotions that she sometimes ignored practical limits. What neither expected was that the disagreement would become the beginning of a friendship. Over the following weeks, they continued working together. Slowly, they started noticing things about each other that changed their first impressions. Tracy saw that Eric's attention to detail was not because he lacked compassion. He genuinely cared. He was the person who stayed after meetings to make sure supplies were organized. He remembered which volunteers needed extra assistance. He quietly solved problems before anyone else even realized there was an issue. Eric saw something in Tracy that impressed him. She had a way of making people feel important. She remembered names. She listened to stories. She noticed when someone was standing alone and found a reason to include them. One afternoon, after a long day of repairs, Eric watched Tracy sit with an elderly woman from the neighborhood for almost an hour. There was nothing she needed from the conversation. She simply listened. Later, as they were cleaning up, Eric said, "You know you don't have to fix every person's problem, right?" Tracy smiled. "I know," but the way she said it made Eric realize she probably did not fully believe it. Over time, their conversations became longer. Volunteer meetings turned into conversations in parking lots after everyone else had left. They talked about family. They talked about their childhoods. They talked about the things that shaped who they became. Tracy learned about Eric's father and the values he carried from him. Eric learned about Tracy's family and the way she had always been the person who noticed when others were struggling. They discovered they had more in common than they first thought. Both had grown up believing responsibility mattered. Both wanted to create a stable life. Both cared deeply about the people around them. The difference was in how they carried that care. Tracy carried everything outward. She looked for ways to help others. Eric carried everything inward. He looked for ways to solve problems privately. At first, those differences created misunderstandings, but eventually, they became the reason they connected. Eric helped Tracy understand that she did not have to rescue everyone to prove she cared. Tracy helped Eric understand that being needed was not the same as being loved. Their relationship did not begin with grand promises. It began with small moments. A conversation after a difficult day. A phone call when one of them needed encouragement. Showing up when life became inconvenient. They became friends before they became partners. And when they eventually chose to build a life together, it was because they had already learned something important. They were different. They saw the world differently. They handled problems differently. But instead of those differences pulling them apart, they discovered they could use them to become better together. Neither of them knew that the same differences that brought balance to their relationship would one day challenge them in ways they never expected. But for now, they were simply two people learning that sometimes the person who understands your weaknesses is also the person who helps you discover your greatest strengths. When Tracy Williams and Eric Carter got married, they knew they were not stepping into a perfect life. Neither of them expected every year to be easy. They had both grown up watching their parents make sacrifices, and they understood that building a family was not just about love. It was about patience, responsibility, and learning how to handle the ordinary challenges that came with everyday life. Their first home was a modest house outside Nashville. It was not the kind of place people would describe as impressive. The kitchen cabinets were older than they wanted. The backyard needed work. There were small repairs everywhere they looked. But when they received the keys and walked through the front door for the first time as husband and wife, they were smiling like they had just bought a mansion. "This is ours," Tracy said, looking around the empty living room. Eric laughed. "You're excited about a house with a broken cabinet door?" Tracy looked at him and smiled. "I'm excited because we're going to fix it. That became one of the first things they learned about marriage. They were not just moving into a house, they were building a home. Their weekends were often spent doing things other couples might have hired someone else to do. They painted walls together, they watched repair videos online, they argued over instructions, and laughed when neither of them actually knew what they were doing. Eric liked to measure everything twice before making a decision. Tracy sometimes wanted to start immediately and figure things out along the way. "You know we could have finished this shelf 3 hours ago," Tracy told him one Saturday afternoon. Eric looked at the instructions in his hand. "And if we had listened to you, it would probably be hanging upside down." She rolled her eyes. "Probably?" He smiled. "Okay, definitely." Those small disagreements became part of their rhythm. They were different, but they were learning how to work together. Money was another area where they had to find balance. They were not struggling to survive, but they were also not living without concerns. They had a mortgage, bills, and future plans they wanted to prepare for. They sat together at the kitchen table many nights reviewing their budget. Tracy would talk about experiences they wanted to have. "We should save for a vacation," she would say. Eric would nod. "I agree, but we should also make sure we're prepared for emergencies." Neither of them was completely wrong. Tracy reminded Eric that life was meant to be enjoyed. Eric reminded Tracy that preparation mattered. Slowly, they found a middle ground. They celebrated small victories. When Eric received a promotion at work, they did not plan an expensive trip or throw a large party. They went to a local restaurant, ordered their favorite meals, and talked about how far they had come. When Tracy completed a professional certification she had worked hard for, Eric surprised her by decorating their living room with photos and handwritten notes. She walked through the doorway after a long day and stopped. "You did all this?" Eric shrugged. "You worked for months. I thought you deserved to know someone noticed." That moment stayed with Tracy, because being noticed mattered to her. It always had. Their happiness was not loud. They were not the couple who constantly shared their lives online or tried to convince people they were perfect. Their best moments happened privately, cooking dinner after a stressful day, talking in bed long after they planned to sleep, laughing about mistakes they made while learning how to be adults together. They were building something meaningful, but underneath the love and the routines, both Tracy and Eric were still carrying lessons they had learned long before they met. Tracy was still the person who wanted to take care of everyone. Eric was still the person who believed problems were easier to handle alone. For years, those qualities helped them. They made them dependable. They made them strong. But eventually, the same habits that helped them survive would begin testing the foundation they had worked so hard to create. For a long time, Tracy and Eric believed they had figured out the balance of marriage. They had learned each other's habits. They knew when the other person needed encouragement and when they needed space. They had created routines that felt comfortable. But as the years passed, small changes began appearing. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make someone looking from the outside think something was wrong. That was what made it difficult to notice. Eric started becoming quieter during stressful seasons. At first, Tracy did not think much of it. She knew his job came with pressure. Managing commercial properties meant dealing with unexpected problems all the time. A tenant could have an issue with a building. A repair could become more expensive than expected. A decision made by someone else could suddenly become his responsibility. So when Eric came home tired and less talkative, Tracy assumed he was simply carrying the weight of work. One evening, she noticed him sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, looking at his phone while barely touching the coffee beside him. "You okay?" she asked. Eric looked up quickly. "Yeah, just a long day." Tracy studied his face for a moment. She knew that expression. It was the same one she had seen on her father when he was worried but did not want anyone else to know. "You sure?" she asked. Eric smiled slightly. "Yeah, Tracy, I'm okay." She wanted to ask again. She wanted to sit down beside him and say, "You don't have to handle everything alone." But she stopped herself, because she had learned something from years of watching people. Sometimes people needed time. At least, that was what she told herself. The truth was that Eric had become better at hiding stress, and Tracy had become better at accepting the explanation. They were both avoiding something. Eric avoided difficult conversations because he believed he was preventing unnecessary worry. Tracy avoided pushing too hard because she believed respecting his space was a way of loving him. Neither of them realized that silence could slowly create the very distance they were trying to avoid. At the same time, Tracy continued being the person everyone depended on. Her phone was always receiving messages. Her mother needed help organizing family events. Friends called when they were facing difficult decisions. Co-workers asked for advice because they trusted her judgment. Eric noticed it. "You know you're allowed to say no sometimes, right?" he told her one night. Tracy smiled while sorting through messages on her phone. "I know." Eric looked at her. "Do you?" She laughed. "I'm serious. I know you are." He reached for her hand. "You spend so much time making sure everyone else is okay." Tracy squeezed his hand. "That's just how I am." And that sentence was something Eric heard often. It was how she was. But over time, he also started realizing something. The woman who encouraged everyone else to be honest about their struggles rarely admitted when she was overwhelmed. They were more alike than they realized. Eric hid problems because he did not want to disappoint people. Tracy carried problems because she did not want to let people down. Both were driven by love. Both were shaped by good intentions. But good intentions did not always create healthy habits. There were moments when they almost talked about it. A late-night conversation after Eric had a difficult week. A quiet evening when Tracy admitted she felt exhausted. A weekend when they both seemed aware that something needed attention. But then life moved forward. There were groceries to buy, bills to pay, family responsibilities, work deadlines. The conversation was always postponed until later, and later became a habit. From the outside, Tracy and Eric still looked like a strong couple. They laughed together. They showed up for each other. They celebrated important moments. But inside their marriage, two people who loved each other were slowly becoming experts at carrying things separately. Neither of them thought they were creating distance. They believed they were protecting what they had. Eric thought keeping problems away from Tracy was an act of love. Tracy thought giving Eric space was an act of trust. They did not know that real trust was not just allowing someone room to handle things. It was allowing them the opportunity to stand beside you when things became difficult. By the time Tracy and Eric reached their 10th wedding anniversary, Tracy found herself thinking about all the moments that had brought them there. 10 years did not feel like just a number to her. It represented every difficult season they had survived, every conversation they had worked through, every ordinary day when they chose each other, even when life was stressful. For Tracy, marriage was not measured by the big moments people usually remembered. It was measured by the small ones, the nights they ate leftovers because neither of them had the energy to cook, the weekends they spent repairing their home, the mornings when one person made coffee for the other without being asked, the quiet ways they had cared for each other when nobody else was watching. That was why Tracy wanted their anniversary to be different, not because she wanted to impress anyone, not because she wanted a picture-perfect celebration. She simply wanted Eric to see something she had seen for years. She wanted him to understand how much he meant to the people around him, especially because Eric had always struggled to see himself the way others saw him. He was the man who showed up, the man who solved problems, the man who remembered responsibilities. But Tracy often wondered if Eric understood that he was loved even when he was not fixing something. So 6 months before their anniversary, she quietly started planning. She kept a notebook hidden in the back of a closet where Eric would never look. Inside were ideas, names, and reminders. She contacted people from different chapters of their lives. Friends from the neighborhood restoration project where they first met. People who remembered their early days together. Family members who had watched their relationship grow. She asked them to send photographs and short messages about Eric. At first, some people were surprised. "Are you sure Eric will like all this attention?" One friend asked her. Tracy laughed. "That's exactly why I want to do it." She knew her husband. Eric was not someone who expected recognition. He was the person who helped clean up after an event, but never stood in the pictures. The person who fixed problems quietly and moved on before anyone thanked him. Tracy wanted one evening where he could simply receive. She collected old photographs from their first years together. Pictures from their first home, photos from family gatherings, images from moments they had almost forgotten. She saved old voice messages and handwritten notes that reminded her of seasons they had overcome. Then she began creating a presentation. It started with a simple idea. Two strangers at a neighborhood project. Two people who disagreed about budgets and priorities. Two people who slowly discovered that their differences made them stronger. She wanted Eric to see the entire journey, not just the successful moments, the difficult ones too, because those were the moments that proved their marriage was real. One evening, while Eric was working late, Tracy sat at the dining room table, organizing pictures. She looked at a photograph from their first year of marriage. They were standing outside their house, both covered in paint after spending an entire weekend fixing a room. Neither of them looked polished. Neither of them looked like they had everything figured out, but they looked happy. Tracy smiled. "That's my favorite one," she whispered to herself, because that picture represented exactly what she loved about their marriage. They had built something together, not something perfect, something real. She imagined Eric walking into the room on their anniversary and seeing everything she had prepared. She imagined his reaction, the surprise, the smile, maybe even the emotional moment he would try to hide. Tracy wanted him to understand one thing. He was not loved because of what he provided. He was loved because of who he was. What she did not know was that while she was collecting memories that proved how well she knew her husband, there was another part of his story waiting to be discovered. A part of their marriage that Eric had carried quietly for years. A part that would force both of them to question what honesty, trust, and love truly meant. And the discovery would happen in the same place where Tracy had been preparing her greatest expression of love. Their home, the morning of their 10th wedding anniversary, began exactly the way Tracy had imagined. Quiet, peaceful, full of anticipation. Eric had already left the bedroom when she woke up. He had a habit of getting up early, especially on work days, and even though it was a special day, he still followed his usual routine. Tracy smiled when she heard the coffee maker running downstairs. Some things never changed. For a moment, she stood in the bedroom doorway and looked around. 10 years, a decade of ordinary mornings like this one. She thought about all the things they had built together and felt grateful. After Eric left for a few hours to handle some work before their celebration later that evening, Tracy moved through the house with the quiet excitement of someone preparing a surprise. The living room was ready. The photographs were organized. The presentation she had spent months creating was almost finished. All she needed was one final document from their first years of marriage. She wanted to include a few details about the early days when they were still learning how to build a life together. So she walked into their home office. It was one of the rooms they rarely used for anything other than paperwork and storage. The shelves were filled with old files, tax documents, and boxes containing memories they always promised they would organize someday. Tracy laughed softly to herself. Someday had become their favorite organizing strategy. She opened one box at a time. Old receipts, insurance papers, documents from their first home. She smiled as she found things she had forgotten about. A restaurant receipt from the night they celebrated Eric's promotion, a handwritten note she had given him during a difficult week. Small pieces of their history that proved how much life could be contained in ordinary objects. Then she found the folder. At first, it did not look unusual. It was simply another file among many others. But when she opened it, she noticed something immediately. The documents were not old. The dates were recent. She paused. For a moment, she assumed she had found something that belonged somewhere else. Maybe Eric had moved some paperwork and forgotten about it. That was possible. Eric was organized, but he was still human. Then she looked closer. There were bank statements, transfer records, payments, accounts she did not recognize. Tracy slowly sat down. She read the first page again, then the second. Her mind tried to create an explanation before her heart could react. Because Eric was careful with money, that was one of the things she admired most about him. They had always talked about their finances. They had made plans together. They had discussed major purchases, savings goals, and future decisions. So why was she seeing information she had never heard about? She looked at the transactions again. One payment could have been a mistake. A few could have been something she simply forgot, but this was not one mistake. It was years, years of decisions, years of transfers, years of something happening behind the scenes. And suddenly, the anniversary presentation sitting in the other room felt different. Only minutes earlier, she had been preparing to tell Eric how deeply she knew him. Now she was sitting in their office wondering if there was a part of him she had never truly understood. She did not feel anger first. That surprised her. She expected anger. She expected disappointment. But what she felt was something much heavier. Confusion. A deep, painful confusion. Because the question in her mind was not, "Why did you spend this money?" It was, "Why didn't you tell me?" Tracy stared at the papers in her hands while the house remained completely quiet around her. The same house they had built together. The same home where she believed they had always faced life side by side. And for the first time in 10 years of marriage, she wondered if there had been a part of their life together where she had been standing alone without knowing it. Eric Carter never planned for the folder to become a secret that lasted years. That was the part he struggled to admit to himself. When everything first started with his younger brother Matthew, Eric did not think he was hiding anything from Tracy. At least, that was what he told himself. He thought he was simply handling a situation until it passed. Matthew had always been different from Eric. Where Eric was careful and calculated, Matthew was more hopeful and spontaneous. He was the kind of person who believed things would work out if he kept trying. Sometimes that optimism helped him take chances other people were afraid to take. But sometimes it also meant he ignored problems until they became impossible to avoid. Over the years, Eric watched his brother make financial decisions that created more pressure. It was never because Matthew did not care. That was what made it difficult for Eric. Matthew was not irresponsible because he was selfish. He was just someone who struggled with planning ahead. When Matthew first reached out for help, Eric remembered sitting in his car after the phone call ended, thinking about their childhood. They had grown up together. They had shared a room. They had gone through difficult seasons as a family. Eric remembered his father working long hours and doing whatever was necessary to keep their family stable. In that moment, helping his brother felt natural. It felt like what family was supposed to do. The first time was small, a bill that needed to be covered, a payment that could not wait. Eric told himself it was temporary, just until Matthew gets back on his feet, he thought, and for a while he believed that would happen. But temporary situations have a way of changing when nobody sets a clear ending. A few months became another year. Another problem appeared, another reason to wait before having a difficult conversation. Every time Eric thought about telling Tracy everything, he imagined the questions, not angry questions. That almost made it harder. He imagined her sitting across from him, trying to understand. He imagined disappointing her. He imagined her looking at him differently. Because Eric knew Tracy valued honesty. He knew she believed marriage meant carrying things together. And that was exactly why he struggled to tell her. The more time passed, the harder the conversation became. He kept thinking, "I'll explain when this is resolved. Then, I'll explain when Matthew is stable. Then, I'll explain when things are less stressful." But life rarely creates a perfect moment for difficult conversations. There was always another expense, another family issue, another reason to wait. Eventually, the secret became bigger than the original problem. The money mattered. The financial impact mattered. But the weight Eric carried was not just about numbers. It was about the fear that he had failed at the one thing he promised himself he would never do. He promised he would protect his family. He promised he would never make them feel unsafe. But somewhere along the way, protecting Tracy became protecting himself from the possibility of disappointing her. That was the truth he avoided. Eric did not create a separate financial life because he wanted something outside his marriage. There was no hidden relationship, no second life, no desire to betray the woman he loved. He made those choices because he was afraid. Afraid of admitting he could not solve everything. Afraid of looking like the kind of person who had problems he could not fix. The same lesson he learned from watching his father sat quietly inside him. Handle it yourself. Do not worry the people you love. Keep moving. Keep providing. Keep control. But what Eric failed to understand was that Tracy never needed him to be someone who never struggled. She needed him to trust her enough to struggle with him. And after years of carrying the secret alone, Eric was about to face the one conversation he had been avoiding since the very beginning. The conversation where he would finally have to explain not only what he did, but why he felt he had to do it without her. Eric knew something was wrong the moment he walked through the front door. Usually, on days when Tracy was preparing something special, there was a certain energy in the house. She would be moving around with excitement. She would be asking questions while pretending she was not trying to give anything away. She would smile whenever he walked into a room because she was terrible at hiding surprises. But that evening was different. The house was quiet, too quiet. Eric placed his keys on the counter and looked toward the living room. The decorations were still there. The photographs were still arranged. The anniversary presentation was still waiting. But Tracy was not standing there smiling. She was sitting at the kitchen table, and in front of her was the folder. Eric stopped. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He knew exactly what she had found. He recognized the papers. He recognized the feeling in her eyes. Not anger, something worse. Hurt. Tracy. His voice was quiet. She looked at him. How long? Those two words carried more weight than any accusation could have. Eric slowly walked closer. I can explain. Tracy looked down at the papers. I know you can. That response surprised him. She was not yelling. She was not accusing him. She was giving him space to tell the truth. And somehow, that made it harder. Why? She asked. Eric sat across from her. I was helping Matthew. Tracy nodded slowly. She had expected there to be a reason. She had not expected that reason to hurt this much. How long have you been doing this? Eric looked down. Several years. The silence that followed felt heavier than an argument. Tracy took a breath. I'm not upset that you helped your brother. Eric looked up. You're not? No. She shook her head. I know who you are, Eric. I know family matters to you. I know you would help someone you love if they were struggling. Her voice became softer. That's not what hurts. Eric already knew the answer, but he needed to hear it. What hurts? Tracy looked at him. I don't understand why you thought I was someone you had to protect from the truth. The question stayed in the room. Eric felt it because he knew there was no easy response. She was not asking why he cared about Matthew. She was asking why he decided she could not stand beside him. I didn't want you to worry, he said. Tracy looked away for a moment. That sounds like something you tell yourself to make it easier. Eric opened his mouth but stopped. Because she was right. He had repeated that explanation so many times that he had started believing it completely. Tracy wiped her eyes. Eric, do you know what hurts the most? He stayed quiet. I spent months planning tonight because I wanted you to see how much your life has mattered. I wanted you to see how many people love you. She looked at the folder. And now I'm sitting here wondering if you ever believed I was one of those people. Eric's expression changed. Tracy, that's not fair. I know you love me. Her voice was calm. That's why this hurts. Eric looked down. For years, he had believed silence was a way of protecting their marriage. But sitting there, watching the person he loved feel excluded from his life, he finally understood something. He had not protected their marriage. He had protected himself from the fear of disappointing her. I thought I was handling it, he admitted. Tracy nodded. That's the problem. She touched the papers lightly. You were handling our life alone. Neither of them spoke for a while. The difficult truth was finally sitting between them. The problem had never only been the money. It was not even Matthew. The real problem began years earlier, when Eric decided love meant carrying everything without letting anyone help. And Tracy realized she had been doing something similar in her own way. She had spent years being the person everyone trusted with their problems, while assuming the people closest to her would automatically know she needed support too. That night did not fix everything. There was no immediate forgiveness, no simple conversation that erased years of silence. But for the first time in a long time, they were finally talking about the thing they had both avoided. Not the numbers, not the paperwork, the fear underneath it. And that was where rebuilding would have to begin. The days after Tracy found the folder were harder than either of them expected. Not because they stopped loving each other. That would have almost been easier to understand. The difficult part was that the love was still there. They still knew each other's routines. They still cared when the other person had a difficult day. They still reached for the same coffee mugs in the morning and asked the same familiar questions. But something had changed. There was now a space between them that had not existed before. A space created by questions. Tracy found herself looking at ordinary moments differently. When Eric checked his phone, she wondered what else she did not know. When he mentioned a family issue, she wondered whether there was more he was keeping to himself. She hated that feeling, because trust had always been one of the things she valued most about their marriage. Before the folder, she believed she understood Eric completely. Now she was forced to accept that there was a part of his life she had never been invited into, and that realization hurt. Eric noticed the change too. The hardest part for him was seeing Tracy become quieter. He had expected anger, he had expected frustration, but he struggled with the distance. The woman who usually asked about his day, reminded him about appointments, and filled the house with conversation was now choosing her words carefully. One evening, they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where they had planned budgets, celebrated promotions, and made decisions about their future. Eric looked at her. "I don't want us to become strangers." Tracy looked down at her hands. "I don't either." "Then tell me what you need." She took a moment before answering. "I need time." Eric nodded. "I understand." But the truth was, he did not fully understand. Eric was someone who wanted solutions. When there was a problem, he wanted to identify it, fix it, and move forward. But this was not a broken appliance. It was not a work issue. It was a wound in their relationship. And wounds did not disappear just because someone wanted them to. Tracy struggled with her own emotions. Part of her felt hurt. Part of her felt guilty for feeling hurt, because she knew Eric had not helped Matthew out of selfishness. She knew his intentions came from loyalty. She knew the man she married was someone who cared deeply about family. But she also knew something else. Intentions did not erase impact. Eric's choice to handle everything alone had changed the way she saw their partnership. For the first time, she wondered if she had been building a marriage where both people were trying so hard to protect each other that neither person was actually being honest. The anniversary celebration remained untouched. The decorations stayed packed away. The photographs Tracy had collected sat in a box. She could not bring herself to throw them away, but she also could not bring herself to celebrate yet. The meaning behind them had changed. Eric felt the weight of that every day. He replayed the conversation in his mind, especially one sentence. "Why did you decide I was someone you needed to protect from the truth?" He had no answer that made him feel better, because the truth was painful. He had trusted himself to carry their problems, but he had not trusted Tracy to stand beside him. And that realization forced him to question something he had believed his entire life. Maybe strength was not always about carrying more. Maybe sometimes strength meant admitting you could not carry everything alone. For the first time in years, Eric had to face the possibility that the way he showed love was not always the way the person he loved needed to receive it. And for Tracy, the challenge was different. She had spent her whole life wanting people to be honest with her. Now she had to decide if she was willing to be honest about her own pain, instead of hiding behind the role of the person who always understood. The first step toward rebuilding their marriage was admitting that the problem was bigger than the folder. For several weeks, Tracy and Eric had talked about what happened, but they kept circling around the same painful questions. Why did Eric hide it? Why did Tracy feel so excluded? Why did two people who loved each other end up handling important parts of life separately? Eventually, they realized they needed help from someone who could look at the situation without taking sides. They met with a financial counselor named Karen Mitchell, who worked with couples dealing with money conflicts. During their first appointment, Tracy sat beside Eric, but noticed they were both sitting differently than they normally would. Usually, they sat close. Their shoulders would touch. One person would naturally reach for the other's hand. But that day, there was space between them. Karen noticed it too. "Before we talk about numbers," she said, looking at both of them, "I want to understand what money represents to each of you." Eric looked confused. Tracy smiled slightly. "That sounds like a strange question." Karen nodded. "It surprises people, but money is rarely only about money." She asked Eric what financial responsibility meant to him. His answer came quickly. Security. Then he paused. Protection. Karen asked why. Eric looked down at his hands. Because I grew up seeing how stressful it was when there wasn't enough. I never wanted my family to feel that. Tracy listened quietly. She had heard pieces of this before, but hearing him explain it in that room made something clearer. Eric was not trying to control everything because he did not care about her. He was trying to prevent the fear he remembered from childhood. Then Karen turned to Tracy. What does financial openness mean to you? Tracy thought for a moment. Trust. She looked at Eric. If we are partners, I need to feel like I'm actually part of the decisions. Karen nodded. And what happens when someone is not included? Tracy looked away. They feel alone. The words stayed with her, because she realized she had spent years feeling alone in smaller ways, too. Not because Eric had intentionally abandoned her, but because she had created a habit of appearing stronger than she felt. She was always the helper, the listener, the person who said, I'm fine, because she did not want to add more weight to someone else's day. For years, she had expected Eric to be emotionally open while rarely admitting when she was overwhelmed. That realization was uncomfortable, because it meant the problem was not only that Eric hid things, it was also that they had both created a marriage where hiding became easier than asking for help. Over the next few meetings, they worked on practical changes. They created complete financial transparency, no private accounts, no major decisions without discussion, no waiting until a problem became impossible to ignore. They also talked about Matthew. That conversation was difficult. Tracy made it clear that she did not blame Eric for wanting to help his brother. She understood loyalty, but she needed boundaries. Helping family could not come at the cost of hiding important decisions from a spouse. Eric finally admitted something he had avoided for years. I kept thinking I was being responsible. He took a breath. But I was really just afraid. Tracy looked at him. Afraid of what? Eric answered honestly. Afraid that if you saw I couldn't fix everything, you would see me differently. That was the moment something shifted, because Tracy understood that fear. She had her own version of it. She had spent years proving she could handle anything, because she was afraid of becoming a burden. They had been protecting each other from their weaknesses while accidentally preventing each other from experiencing true partnership. Eric learned that responsibility did not mean carrying every problem alone. Tracy learned that being strong did not mean never needing support. They were not suddenly healed. But for the first time since the folder was opened, they were no longer standing on opposite sides of the problem. They were finally standing beside each other. Healing did not happen in one conversation. Tracy and Eric both knew that. They had spent years developing the habits that created the distance between them, so they understood that rebuilding trust would require more than apologies. It would require consistency, small choices, repeated actions, proof that things were truly changing. At first, the changes felt unfamiliar. Eric started sharing things before they became problems, not just the major issues, even the smaller ones. One evening, he came home from work and sat beside Tracy on the couch. I had a difficult conversation with one of the property owners today, he said. Before, Eric would have waited until he had already solved the issue. He would have researched the problem, created a plan, and only mentioned it after everything was under control. But this time, he told her while he was still figuring it out. Tracy noticed. What happened? And instead of saying, nothing to worry about, Eric explained. They talked about it. They considered options. They did not solve everything immediately, but that was not the point. For Eric, the important part was learning that sharing a problem did not make him weaker. It made him less alone. Tracy also began changing. She started allowing herself to be cared for. That was harder than she expected. For years, she had been the person who brought meals when someone was sick, offered advice when someone was struggling, and stepped in whenever she saw a need. Receiving help felt uncomfortable. One Saturday morning, Eric noticed her trying to handle too many things at once. She was cleaning the house, answering messages, and organizing family plans. You know you don't have to do all of that today, he said. Tracy smiled. I'm almost finished. Eric looked at her. That's what you always say. She laughed, but this time she stopped. She looked around and realized something. She had spent years proving she could handle everything. Maybe she did not have to. "Can you help me with this?" she finally asked. It was a small sentence, but for Tracy, it represented something much bigger. She was letting someone else carry part of the weight, and Eric understood how important that was. Their marriage did not return to exactly what it was before. In some ways, that was a good thing. The version of their relationship before the discovery looked strong from the outside, but both of them now understood that strength without openness could become fragile. They started having conversations they used to avoid, about money, about fears, about family expectations, about the pressure they each felt to always be the dependable one. They learned that honesty was not just telling the truth when someone asked a question. Honesty was creating a relationship where difficult truths had somewhere safe to go. Months later, Tracy brought up the anniversary celebration again. The decorations were still stored away. The photographs were still in the box. The presentation she created was still saved on her computer. "I don't know if I want to do it the way I planned," she told Eric. He understood. The original celebration had been created from the belief that they had built something perfect, but they both knew now that they had not. Eric reached for her hand. "Maybe it doesn't have to be perfect." Tracy looked at him. Maybe it shouldn't be. So they decided to continue with the anniversary celebration, but differently. It would not be a performance showing everyone how flawless their marriage was. It would be a reminder of something more honest. Two people who made mistakes. Two people who hurt each other without intending to. Two people who chose to face the truth instead of running from it. When they finally celebrated their 10th anniversary, the meaning behind the evening had changed. The photos were still there. The memories were still there. But now, they represented something deeper, not perfection, growth. Because the strongest marriages are not the ones where problems never appear. They are the ones where two people learn how to stop hiding when problems do. And for Tracy and Eric, the folder that nearly pulled them apart became the reason they finally learned how to stand together. When Tracy and Eric finally celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary, the evening looked different from the one Tracy had originally planned. In many ways, it was simpler. There were fewer decorations. There was no pressure to create a perfect moment. There was no need to prove anything to anyone, and somehow, that made it more meaningful. The gathering took place at their home outside Nashville, the same place where so many ordinary memories had been created. The same walls that had witnessed their happiest moments had also witnessed difficult conversations, quiet mornings, and the uncomfortable process of rebuilding trust. Family and close friends arrived throughout the evening. People who had known Tracy and Eric before they were married. People who remembered the neighborhood restoration project where they first met. People who had watched them grow from two different individuals into a couple. As guests walked into the living room, they saw photographs displayed throughout the space. Pictures from their first home, photos from family gatherings, images from years when they had no idea how much life would change them. Tracy stood nearby watching people smile as they recognized different memories. "That picture was taken after you both painted your entire living room in one weekend, right?" one friend asked. Tracy laughed. "Yes." Eric smiled. "And we learned that neither of us should ever pretend we know what we're doing with home repairs." Everyone laughed. It was a small moment, but it represented something important. They were no longer afraid of admitting they were imperfect. Later in the evening, their friends began sharing stories. One person talked about how Eric had quietly helped during a difficult season without ever expecting recognition. Another shared how Tracy had always made people feel seen and valued. As Eric listened, he looked uncomfortable at first. That was who he had always been. He never liked being the center of attention. But this time, he allowed himself to hear it. He allowed himself to understand that people did not appreciate him because he had everything under control. They appreciated him because of who he was. After dinner, Tracy told everyone she wanted to show something. For a moment, Eric looked surprised. He thought she had changed her mind about the presentation, and in some ways, she had. The presentation on the screen was not exactly the one she had created 6 months earlier. She had changed it. The first version was about celebrating everything they had built. This version was about celebrating everything they had learned. The photographs were still there. The memories were still there. But now there were also moments of honesty. The early struggles, the mistakes, the seasons when they had to learn how to communicate better. Tracy stood beside Eric as the images appeared. "I originally made this because I wanted Eric to see how much people love him," she said. She paused, but somewhere along the way, I realized something. She looked at him. Love is not just about knowing someone's best qualities. It is also about making room for their fears, their mistakes, and the things they are still learning. The room became quiet. Eric looked down for a moment, because he knew exactly what she meant. Their difficult season had not erased the love they shared, but it had changed their understanding of it. After everyone left that night, Tracy and Eric stood together in the living room. The photographs were still on the walls. The memories were still around them, but now those memories carried a different meaning. They were not proof that their marriage had always been perfect. They were proof that their marriage had survived being honest. Eric looked at Tracy. "I'm sorry I didn't let you stand beside me sooner." Tracy held his hand. "I'm sorry I spent so many years pretending I never needed anyone beside me." And in that quiet moment, they both understood something they had spent years learning. A strong marriage was not built by avoiding difficult moments. It was built by facing them together. Years later, Tracy would still remember the moment she opened that folder. She remembered the quiet of the home office. She remembered the way the sunlight came through the window that morning. She remembered sitting there with papers in her hands, trying to understand how something so important could have existed without her knowing. For a long time, that memory was connected to pain. Whenever she thought about the folder, she remembered the confusion, the disappointment, the feeling of wondering whether she had truly known her own husband. But as the years passed, her understanding of that moment changed. Not because what Eric did was suddenly acceptable. It was not. Tracy never forgot that secrecy had consequences. She never forgot how lonely it felt to realize that someone she loved had been carrying a major burden without trusting her enough to share it. But she also learned to see the full picture. She learned that people are often shaped by the things they experience long before they meet us. Eric's silence did not begin with her. It began years earlier, sitting at a kitchen table watching his father hide financial stress behind a calm expression. It began with a young boy learning that love meant protecting people from worry. It began with a promise Eric made to himself that he would never allow his own family to feel unsafe. The problem was that Eric never learned the difference between protecting someone and excluding them. That was the lesson they both had to learn. Tracy also became more honest about her own role. For years, she had believed she was the emotionally open person in their marriage. After all, she noticed things. She asked questions. She encouraged people to share their feelings. But when she looked deeper, she realized she had her own version of hiding. She hid behind being capable. She hid behind being the person everyone could depend on. She often told people she was fine because she did not want to create another problem for someone else to solve. She wanted Eric to trust her with his struggles. But she had also spent years making it difficult for others to see hers. That realization changed the way she viewed their marriage. They were not two people where one person was honest and one person was not. They were two people who had learned different ways to protect themselves. Eric protected people by keeping problems away from them. Tracy protected people by carrying problems for them. Neither approach created the kind of closeness they both wanted. Over time, their marriage became different. Not because they stopped having problems. They still disagreed. They still had stressful seasons. They still had moments where old habits tried to return. But now they talked about them. They asked questions before making assumptions. They shared fears before those fears became decisions. They created a relationship where honesty was not something they practiced only during difficult moments. It became part of everyday life. Years after that anniversary, Tracy would sometimes walk past the old home office and think about the folder, the same folder that once made her question everything. She no longer saw it only as the thing that almost broke their marriage. She saw it as the moment that forced them to build a more truthful one. Because sometimes the hardest moments in a relationship are not there to destroy what exists. Sometimes they reveal what needs to change. The folder did not create the problems between Tracy and Eric. It revealed the problems they had been quietly carrying for years. And once those things were finally brought into the light, they had a choice. They could hold on to the pain, or they could use the truth as the beginning of something better. They chose the second option, not because rebuilding was easy, but because they finally understood that love was not about protecting each other from every difficult thing life brought. Love was about trusting each other enough to face those difficult things together. Looking back, Tracy often thought about how differently she had imagined their 10th anniversary. She had planned every detail because she wanted to celebrate the life she and Eric had built. She wanted to honor the years of commitment, the sacrifices, and all the small moments that had turned two strangers into a family. She thought the greatest gift she could give him was a reminder of how perfect their journey had been. But life had a way of showing her something different. Their marriage was never special because it was perfect. It was special because it was real. The truth was, every couple carries things they do not always know how to say. Some people hide their fears because they do not want to appear weak. Some people hide their pain because they do not want to become a burden. Some people believe they are protecting the people they love when they are actually creating distance. Tracy and Eric had both done this in their own ways. Eric had spent years believing that love meant standing in front of every problem alone. He thought being a good husband meant making sure Tracy never had to worry. But he eventually learned that a marriage was not a place where one person carried the weight while the other person watched from a distance. It was a partnership. Tracy had spent years believing that being strong meant always having something to give. She believed love meant being available, dependable, and prepared. But she learned that allowing someone to support her was not a weakness. It was also a form of trust. The day Tracy found the folder was painful. There was no way around that. It changed the way she saw her husband. It challenged the way she understood their relationship. But years later, she no longer viewed that moment as the day everything fell apart. She viewed it as the day they finally stopped pretending. Because after the questions were asked and the difficult conversations were finally spoken, they built something stronger than what they had before. Not a marriage without problems. A marriage where problems had somewhere to go. A marriage where Eric could say, "I'm struggling," without feeling like he had failed. A marriage where Tracy could say, "I need help," without feeling like she had disappointed someone. A marriage where both people understood that love was not proven by how much pain they could carry alone. It was proven by their willingness to trust each other with the truth. Years after that anniversary celebration, Tracy would sometimes look through the photographs from that night. She would see the pictures of their home, their friends, their memories, and she would remember the lesson hidden inside the story. The folder that once represented everything she thought was missing from her marriage eventually became the thing that helped them find what they needed most: honesty, understanding, and the courage to be fully known. Because real love is not built by two perfect people who never disappoint each other. Real love is built by two imperfect people who are willing to tell the truth, accept accountability, and choose each other again after the truth is revealed. Sometimes the hardest discoveries do not reveal that someone stopped loving you. Sometimes they reveal something more complicated. Sometimes they reveal that someone loved you deeply but never learned how to let you carry the weight with them. And sometimes the moment that hurts the most becomes the moment that teaches two people how to love each other better than they ever did before. If this story stayed with you, I want to ask you something. Have you ever loved someone who was carrying a struggle they never told you about? Or maybe you have been the person who stayed quiet because you thought protecting others meant handling everything on your own. Sometimes the people closest to us are not hiding things because they do not love us. Sometimes they are hiding because they are afraid of disappointing us, afraid of appearing weak, or afraid of admitting they cannot handle everything alone. But true connection begins when we stop trying to be perfect for each other and start being honest with each other. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What lesson did Tracy and Eric's journey teach you? Do you believe honesty can rebuild a relationship after trust has been damaged? Your story or perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Thank you for being part of the Daily Comfort Stories family. If this story brought you comfort, reflection, or a reminder about the importance of love and understanding, make sure to subscribe and join us for more heartfelt stories about family, forgiveness, second chances, and the choices that shape our lives. Until our next story, remember, sometimes the truth hurts when it first arrives, but the right truth can also become the beginning of healing.